it then just hit me. This is crazy that we kind of found agreement on universal background checks and permits and red flag laws. Why the hell is nothing being done? And then over the course of the last couple of years, Matt, I hear from gun owners all the time who are telling me the same thing. We ought to be doing some of these things.
You're listening to Talking About Guns, or TAG as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman. I'm executive director of 97%. We're a bipartisan organization working to reduce gun deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate, talk about the hot button issues, but without the screaming. Later in this episode, Dr. Michael Siegel, a renowned researcher and professor at Tufts University, joins us for another edition of Siegel's Scope, where Dr. Siegel examines the effect of state gun laws on the occurrence and severity of mass shootings. But first, my guest today is a self-proclaimed gun nut who received high marks from the NRA throughout his tenure in Congress, where he represented Illinois' 8th District from 2011 to 2013. He started a conservative radio talk show upon leaving Washington, challenged Donald Trump in the Republican primary for president in 2020, and now hosts his own podcast called White Flag, which is focused on finding common ground. You'll often see him on CNN and MSNBC now attacking the NRA and calling upon his fellow gun owners to advocate for reforms. He is also 97%'s newest board member. Congressman Joe Walsh, welcome to TAG.
Hey, Matt, it's great to be with you. Do me a favor, though. Please call me Joe.
Okay, Joe.
I insist.
All right, Joe. All right. So first of all, so folks know, and we mentioned in the intro, you're now a 97% advisory board member. But I can't say that when we started 97% 10 years ago, it would have been the appropriate thing for you. Your views on the gun issue have definitely evolved over time. Can you tell us how that process worked for you?
It's fine, man. Suffice to say, I wouldn't have been on the 97% board 10 years ago. Look, my views on guns have evolved slightly. My tone on guns and my desire to try to find common ground on this issue have changed immeasurably. Matt, you know me. I'm a gun nut. I'm a gun nut. I'm a self-described gun nut. A huge, very outspoken gun rights proponent. I'm Charlton Heston, right? Grabbing from my cold dead hands. And I've always felt that way. It's always been a freedom thing to me. But over the course of the last 2 to 3 to 4 years, speaking to people like you and a number of others, and then just the barrage of so many mass shootings compelled me to say, we got to look at something. And I was never there, like, we got to do something. Something changed where I said, even me, we've got to do something.
But did the something change for you on the gun issue? It changed, but is that an overall change to how you view politics? In other words, 2016, you're at the moment a Trump supporter.
Yeah.
And I think you said something like, if Trump doesn't win, I'm going to grab my gun or some...
Grab my musket. Still my favorite thing.
Musket, right, okay. But then I think as time goes on, it occurs to you that maybe Trump isn't what you thought that he would be. And did that prompt some introspection for you that...
Yes.
And okay, and tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, and again, I've been very public about this because it's been a very open, naked, public journey I've been on. Going from Tea Party congressman to right-wing radio talk show host to, as you said, voting for Trump in 2016, to then becoming Trump's most outspoken conservative opponent, to then doing the stupidest thing I've ever done, running a primary challenge against Trump in 2020. People like me helped lead to Trump. The Republican Party establishment ignored their base. And then Tea Party people like me, Matt, inflamed the base so that when Trump came along, they were primed for a demagogue. I have to live with that. I have to live with the role I played in helping to bring that divisive SOB, putting him in the White House. Once he got elected and I really started to pay attention to him, I was scared I mean, I was slapped. And I thought to myself, Matt, my God, in the last 8 years, have I sounded even like a hundredth of what Trump sounds like? So it caused me to say, I'm tired of being a divisive figure. I want to do something about the divide. And that's what I've done the last 5 years. And specifically, Matt, on the gun issue, kind of like only Nixon could go to China.
Right.
Because I'm such sometimes a strident gun rights advocate, I think it's going to take someone like me helping to lead the way to get others to join, to get change.
So, but then in order to have that introspection, you then have to be proactive about figuring out, not necessarily that your views are wrong in what you're saying, this is what you're saying, but that the way you may have gone about it, in other words, if you want to get things done, working with people, listening to people, building coalitions might be a more effective way to do it.
Yeah, but to be fair, you're right, my friend. My views have changed a little, but my overall tone has changed. When I was in Congress 8, 9 years ago, the NRA ruled, and the NRA's philosophy, as you know, is don't give an inch, don't even open that door. Do you not open that door to any reform? And so Republican pro-gun people like me, we opposed any reform because we were afraid of that door opening. I got tired of that. I left the NRA 4 or 5 years ago, and I got tired of that push to not even open the door to reform. And the other change was, and you've heard this from gun owners, and I hear this from gun owners all the time, the rash of mass shootings the last 4 to 5 years. Every day and week, I hear from gun owners like me, I'm tired of this. It's wrong, it's bad, it's evil, but it's giving gun owners like us a bad name. And that got me on this road that's right. So we should do whatever we can to make sure bad, evil, sick people don't get guns. And then that opened me up to potential reforms like universal background checks and the rest.
So let's go back there for a second. So when the potential reforms were happening, the idea would be if you open the door on something like, let's say, background checks, that would lead to the door swinging open and guns would get taken away from everybody, kind of thing, slippery slope type stuff?
Slippery slope, couldn't even entertain it.
Okay.
And you know, like I know, and I know as a former member of Congress, this is drilled into you.
Right.
Now, look, I didn't. So the NRA gave me money. They can't give me a lot of money. So it wasn't the money, but it was. I'm a big pro-gun guy, and most of us bought that. Yeah, if you open that door a little bit, slippery slope, before you know it, next month your guns are going to be gone.
I want to spend a second on what you just said.
What?
So a lot of people, I think, have a misimpression generally that if the NRA is involved in a race, they're buying people's votes. And you just said the NRA gives you money, they give you a little bit. I don't think people, I'm going to insult people, but I don't think people understand the fact that you're not getting $1 bazillion from the NRA. You have a position, that's your position.
Right.
And if people want you to change your view, they have to win that argument with you. It's not about the money. It's about your view. Is that correct?
Spot on. People always tend to get this backwards. The NRA knocked on my door when I got elected because of my views, because I was pro-gun. And so it was easy for me to accept their $5,000 check or whatever. Big deal. But they came to me because of my views. Now, once they come to you, there's enormous pressure to stay on the team. And Matt, you know, the other thing the NRA could do that was always more valuable to me than money is, what is the NRA? It's a bunch of gun owners. Right. So they could reach out to gun owners in your congressional district or in your state and say, Joe Walsh gets an A+ on guns, baby, because he didn't open the door and no slippery slope in the rest. Right. So there was huge pressure to toe the line.
So in terms of what it wasn't even if there were slight reforms that you liked, you're turned off by that, but now, by the overall picture of it, but now you start to you've met with the folks from Parkland, for example.
Yeah.
How does that happen? How does that even come about?
Well, so I launched my podcast about a year ago called White Flag with Joe Walsh. And every week I sit down with somebody who doesn't think like me, somebody who has a completely different worldview than me. And all we try to do, Matt, for an hour is sit down and have respectful conversation about an issue that we vehemently disagree on. If we can find some common ground, great. But I'm trying to help model how to have respectful dialogue in a world that just doesn't do it.
Can you cite, before we get to people on the gun issue, can you cite a couple of examples for people you've had on your podcast?
Oh my gosh. I'll give you one that will ring really true. Look, I was a Tea Party culture warrior. So, and I was, right-wing media. So, man, you try to scare people and you go after the gun issue and you go after the race issue and you go after the LGBTQ issues. Because the right-wing audience believes that Democrats want to teach your kindergartners how to be transgender. So they throw out crap like that. I've always been generally tolerant, but I've always had real concerns with some of those issues. I sat down with Charlotte Clymer, who lives in Washington, D.C., who's a longtime LGBTQ activist, a transgender woman herself. And Matt, we talked for an hour and 20 minutes, and I was blown away by how much she taught me about that issue, how difficult it is, how, like, she said to me, Joe, I didn't choose to be this way. This is who I am. When you hear things like that, it really helps open up your mind. And by the way, then at the end of an hour and 20-minute conversation, we found some areas of common ground. It's really pretty cool.
So how often do you tape that, Congressman?
I have a long conversation like that once a week, and then a couple other short mini conversations twice a week.
Okay. And then you meet with Fred Gutenberg. And how did that come about?
I met, two things happened. I met with David Hogg, who we both know, Parkland, back in May. He sent out a challenge to pro-gun people in April and said, I'm willing to find some common ground. Is there any big, huge pro-gun guy that will sit down with me? And everybody on my side ignored David Hogg. So I reached out to David and I said, David, let you and I sit down. So we sat down for an hour and 15, 20 minutes.
When you say you sat down, were you in person or were you by Zoom or what'd you do?
I insisted that this was by person. So we sat down in a studio together. What a great, great kid. That's the other thing, Matt. He and I have become friends. Like, I've gotten to know him. I give him advice. He gives me advice. But that was the first time we met. And so we're in a studio together. David's who he is. I'm who I am on guns. And it started out kind of slowly, but we started to listen to each other. And we were both willing to look at where we could find common ground. And Matt, it kept coming back to this idea of, I don't want guns banned. Would you look, David said, Joe, would you consider doing better things up front to make sure somebody who shouldn't have a gun doesn't get one? And I said, sure. So then we got into some potential reforms. And
then Fred, the same thing?
Yeah, same thing. I sat down with Fred and Chris Brown at Brady. And that was really interesting because to get Chris's perspective on a lot of the research that they deal with, Fred and I have just become brothers. And same thing. After a little over an hour, Chris Brown, Fred Gutenberg, and Joe Walsh disagreed on, I'd say, 75% of the reforms we brought up. But there were 20 to 25% of things that we agreed on, things you and I, Matt, have talked about.
Right.
And then it then just hit me. This is crazy that we kind of found agreement on universal background checks and permits and red flag laws. Why the hell is nothing being done? And then over the course of the last couple of years, Matt, I hear from gun owners all the time who are telling me the same thing. We ought to be doing some of these things.
So Fred's an interesting guy because I think, people, there was the time he yelled at the State of the Union and he yelled at Trump. And I don't remember if he got kicked out or what happened. I think he did. He did get kicked out. But he's actually fairly moderate, I find, more moderate than you would think based on what had happened on that issue. So when we talk about the common ground and what we all agree upon, what do you see as those areas that we do agree upon?
Fred, by the way, Fred Gutenberg is moderate in his politics, but he's an activist.
Yeah.
And he, as everybody knows, he lost a daughter, right? Like, I don't know what that would do to me. It turned him into Superman as an activist.
Well, think about it. He was a Dunkin' Donuts franchise guy in Florida.
Yeah.
And his daughter got shot in the back going up the steps. I mean, it's unbelievably bad story. Just the fact that they've kept the family together, even forgetting, everything else.
Matt, that's right. And look, Fred and I have become very close, and that's a constant struggle.
Yeah.
Fred and I were together, Matt, in D.C. about a week ago. The Center for American Progress had their big summit on gun violence, and we did a panel in front of victims of and families of victims of gun violence, and same thing, like how he and I came together and how we're trying to push for certain reforms we can agree upon.
He's an interesting guy. So when we see the common ground on guns, Congressman, I'm going to keep calling you Congressman because I'm very respectful. I was raised that way. Sorry. What do we think of the common ground is?
There are two wings here, right? One is go after guns that are already out there. Go after guns that the vast majority of legal law-abiding gun owners have, or move heaven and earth up front before a gun is bought to make sure that that person should have that gun. And I think, Matt, that's the sweet spot. You've been ahead of me on this. That's probably always been the sweet spot, right? But again, to go back to the NRA and all my former colleagues, many of whom still don't want to open the door to an inch. They don't even want to go there. Screw that. Most gun owners are willing to go there, and damn it, they want to go there. So universal background checks, gun permitting at the state level, red flag laws, just the beginning, things like that we can do with real muscle and teeth.
So those are the top ones. And when we talk about them, those are the ones that probably pull the best. We also talk about if you've committed a misdemeanor, that's a violent crime as well. And we've talked about the state permitting laws, which we think are super important. Those background checks are better than when you have the federal background check, for example. So those are the areas of agreement. So is there room, in the Republican Party, there was some movement last June when that legislation passed. I think maybe 10 senators on the Republican side voted for it. I could be wrong. That was movement. Do you see this issue over time continuing to gain more support? Because I think that the polling shows that, John Cornyn did polling when it was time for that legislation in June, that the constituencies are in favor of what you've just mentioned as these basic reforms.
As I said last week, I hope we don't blow this, because I think we are at the beginning of an amazing moment in time where this stuff can get done. And it can't be Democrats out front leading the charge for universal background checks. It can't be the left. It's got to be people like me. It's got to be the right. It's got to be gun owners. Really, Matt, it's got to be, I always have to watch my language. It's got to be gun owners getting off their ass and saying, I'm not just going to sit at the table for red flag laws, universal background checks, and gun permitting at the state level. I'm going to lead the charge on this stuff. And I think it's an amazing moment in time, Matt, because I think they're ready to do it. I hear from them. Your polling indicates this. They're looking for a vehicle to jump onto.
So how do we do that, Congressman? How do we get more gun owners?
You know what you do, Matt? You plant your flag tomorrow and you start and by the way, and I think you feel the same way, lobbying is not a bad word to me.
Right.
You plant our founders believed in lobbying groups and interest groups. You plant your flag tomorrow, a brand new lobbying group of gun owners around the country to push this stuff and go at the NRA.
Wait, can you do me a favor? Can you say the word tomorrow again?
Tomorrow.
That is the most Midwestern I've heard you sound. Wow.
Chicago.
Right.
I'm from Chicago.
Go. That was good.
Tomorrow.
Yeah. The other stuff is minor compared to that. So in terms of getting people and saying we're gun owners, we support, these are the ideas that we support.
97% has provided, no pun intended, the ammunition. You've got the vast majority of gun owners out there. This is what they tell me all the time, saying, I'm with you, Joe. What do we do? There's no group. There's no vehicle. There's no, and again, Matt, it's just my own bias. Gabby Giffords, God love her. The left can't lead with this. Right. I think there's an opportunity here to build a lobbying group of responsible gun owners, hyperbole, to drive the NRA out of business, but certainly to dwarf the NRA. And that's got to be done. And I think that's the final piece.
So when we talk about what happened in June in the legislation, there was an article in Politico right before the November elections that said, you know, none of these people who voted for gun reforms are paying a political price. Right, which is new. You know, you go back, we could talk about the famous example of Al Gore being afraid of gun issues and that whole thing. Does it seem to you now that there are no repercussions generally? Like, in other words, let's say you came into Congress now, right? How would you deal with this issue if your constituents in your district might not favor gun reforms, but the nation would? How do you deal with that?
If right-wing pro-gun Joe Walsh were a Republican in Congress today, I have no doubt, even if I'm representing a right or center-right district, I could publicly take a stand right now for universal background checks, gun permitting, stronger red flag laws with due process, and a few other reforms, and I wouldn't be hurt. And Matt, it wouldn't have been that way 8, 9, 10 years ago.
Right.
I'd have been pounded and I'd have been primaried. That wouldn't be the case now. Now, if I go out there, Matt, and I say, you know what, we got to look at these assault weapons. We got to look at banning this or doing some of these other things. Hello, you're gone. But these reforms that you and I are talking about as a Republican today, you wouldn't pay the price. And I go back to what you said, Matt. In June, Republicans, enough of them felt emboldened that they could say no to the NRA because the NRA opposed even that opening of the door.
Right. You know, Congressman, my example of this is always, you know, in Florida, for example, they have red flag laws. Do you hear anybody revolting against the government in Florida? It becomes, some of these laws are so basic that if you have a couple of these laws, once you start to get into things like a specific type of gun, people are going to get pissed off. But when you have things like permits and background checks, I don't see people getting super agitated about that. I think that just becomes part of the fabric.
Of all of these reforms that we're talking about, my sense with gun owners is, even responsible gun owners who are with us, they'll want to know more about red flag laws because there is some constitutional due process concerns. But generally, with those, they're all over them, and they support these things. This is Matt, you know, because you've been in politics for so long. This is really a weird moment in time where I think there's an opportunity here to do it, but people like me on the right have to lead it.
Thing just before about being primaried. It always seems to me that people, you know, if they lose these races, they go on to still a very nice life, right? They may go on to work for an organization. They may
Yeah.
lobby, whatever. They may be on TV. Yeah, I think you fit every one of these criteria, but something good comes out of it still. So what is the fear that if you vote the way you actually believe and you get primaried, why is that such a fear that you might lose? Why is that so important?
Because, and you know this, young man, because it's a great gig to be a member of the House or the Senate. It's heady stuff. It goes to your head. You become consumed with your importance and your power. You feel like you are sitting while you serve, you're sitting at the most important table in the whole joint. You do not want to lose that. Matt, think about all my former Republican colleagues in Trump. For the 5.5 years I've been out against Trump, I've had hundreds of them tell me privately, I love what you say about him, Joe, but I'm never going to say that. Why did so many sell their soul? They don't want to lose that gig. And they don't think in terms of, I can get a better gig on the outside TV lobbying. It's a power thing.
It's so interesting. Well, that is the finest example, which is because I've had some of these same conversations that you have with people who say, I absolutely cannot stand people who worked in the White House, from people who worked, starting with Celebrity Apprentice to people who worked in the White House who say this is impossible. And sometimes when they are out of the White House, you've heard some of that commentary from some cabinet secretaries there who are not running for office.
Yeah.
But you don't hear it from the members themselves. And I just have to say, it's always surprised me. So 2 more questions. One is in a second, Congressman, I'm going to ask you, at the end of our podcast, we always ask our guests to tag another person to be on the podcast. So I'm going to do that in a minute. But what do you see now as the biggest hurdle and the biggest opportunity as we go forward on gun safety? What's stopping us and what's the best opportunity?
Well, again, to be redundant, and I apologize, the biggest opportunity is that this is a moment in time that we have not been in years where gun owners can lead the charge for really major reform. The biggest obstacle is those gun owners will not be sufficiently organized or energized to do so. And then they'll be out there in the hinterlands complaining like you and I are and not organized.
So that's very good. Very well said. Of course, coming from you, it's well said. And then in terms of tagging a future guest, Congressman, who would you like us to have on here on the podcast?
So this is interesting. I honestly, you've caught me because I didn't think about this question. One name that comes to me right away is Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to do whatever I can to help get her on this podcast. Liz Cheney is every bit as crazy, lovable, crazy pro-gun as I am. I don't know that I've heard Liz speak to these issues, universal background checks and red flag laws. I think she has such a big voice. It would be interesting to find out where she stands.
For sure. And by the way, speaking of somebody who voted their conscience and was not afraid.
Yeah.
That would be Liz Cheney.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Congressman, thank you for joining us today on the podcast, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you, Congressman.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
And now for Dr. Siegel with Siegel Scope.
Well, thanks, Matt, and welcome to another edition of Siegel Scope. What I want to talk about is the evidence regarding the effectiveness of laws in preventing mass shootings, either in decreasing the incidence of mass shootings occurring in the first place, or decreasing the number of casualties that occur when there is one of these tragic events. I want to preface this by saying that we shouldn't only look at mass shootings. Mass shootings only represent less than 1% of all firearm fatalities. So there's a danger in only looking at mass shootings. It's important to look at all forms of gun violence. And we've done that over the past weeks on Siegel Scope and on TAG. We've looked at many forms of gun violence and the overall evidence regarding the population impact of various policies. So it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about this. Nevertheless, it is a reasonable question to say, of all these laws that we studied, and we've studied many impacts, and we've talked about homicide in general, and we've talked about suicide in general, what does the evidence say specifically about mass shootings? Well, a number of colleagues of mine and I published a paper just a couple of years ago in the journal Law and Human Behavior. And we looked specifically at the question of what laws are effective in reducing the incidence or severity of mass shootings. And we looked at a long list of different possible laws that could have affected. We looked at probably 80 or 90 different laws that could have affected the rate of mass shootings. This was a study that was done at the state level. So we were looking at differences between states in the presence of these various laws. And after controlling for a wide range of variables at the state level, we were able to determine what factors, what laws were associated with, if any, a decline in the incidence or severity of mass shootings. And the findings were twofold. First, we found one law that had a significant effect in reducing the incidence of mass shootings. And secondly, we found one law which had a significant effect in reducing the number of casualties when a mass shooting does occur. So let's talk first about the incidence. We found that one law, and that is requirements for gun permits. So gun permitting laws by which a state requires that you have to have a state issued permit in order to obtain a gun or to own a gun, that those laws were effective. And the magnitude of that effect was large. Looking at the paper here, we found a 70% reduction, 60% reduction, 60% lower odds of a mass shooting occurring in a state that had a permit law in effect. So that's basically cutting the rate of mass shootings in half. And basically what we found is that states that have these permit laws have only about half the rate of mass shootings as would be expected if they didn't have that law in effect compared to when you compare them to other states. What about the number of casualties that occur in such an event? Well, we found that one law, and that was state limits on the size of ammunition magazines. So when you have detachable ammunition magazines, states that limited the size of those or the capacity of those to 10 or less, those states had, in this case, it was 38% fewer fatalities and 77% fewer non-fatal injuries. So a very significant reduction in the number of casualties that occur when a mass shooting does occur. So the limiting magazine capacity it's not going to reduce the incidence of a mass shooting, but if one does occur, it seems to have an effect on the number of casualties. So I want to close by talking a little bit about the plausibility, the conceptual meaning behind this. So conceptually, why is it that permit requirements seem to have an effect in reducing mass shootings? And I think the answer is simple. In the overall literature that we've reviewed over the past weeks on TAG and that we've presented through the 97%, what we have been basically found is that laws that aim to keep guns out of the hands of people with at the most dangerous level of risk are the most effective ones in reducing all forms of firearm violence, whether it's homicide, suicide, or here mass shootings. It just makes it much more difficult for people to get their hands on guns, and that seems to have the biggest effect in reducing gun violence. Why conceptually do assault weapon bans not have an effect? I think the main reason is that it only affects the type of weapon that's available. And it's unlikely that somebody is going to say to themselves, that they're planning a mass shooting and then they find out that they can't have an AR-15, it's not available. So they decide, well, I'm going to cancel the whole thing. I can't use an AR-15. I'm not going to do this at all. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a plausible scenario. It seems like a person is going to use what is available in such a tragic circumstance. And the same thing for for the number of casualties, unlike what many people believe, assault weapons are not any more lethal than non-assault weapons, assuming they're semi-automatic weapons. In fact, the firing rate of assault weapons is exactly the same as any other semi-automatic weapon, which is basically as fast as you can pull the trigger. The lethality is not any higher. If anything, it's slightly lower only because the caliber of ammunition that's used in those, typically used in those types of guns, tends to be a little bit smaller than what's available in other semi-automatic rifles. What about the magazine capacity? Well, that would be expected to have an effect, because when the perpetrator has to change out the magazine, switch another magazine in, that is a moment of opportunity for some sort of intervention, for somebody to grab the shooter, for people to flee. And although it's very true that people who are experienced using these magazines can switch them very quickly. I've been told that, I have friends who can do it in 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Typically, when you're dealing with mass shooting situations, you're not dealing with very, very experienced shooters. They're often young people. They're often people who, don't have a lot of experience with firearms. And so there may be clumsiness, and they may not be able to switch it out that quickly. And so it really does present an opportunity for there to be an intervention. Back to you, Matt.
I'm Matthew Littman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and tell your friends about us. You can find more episodes of TAG on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org, and tag who you'd like us to chat with next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.